All right, let's dive in. Today, we're talking about one of literature's most complicated and honestly angriest figures, Jonathan Swift. He was a satirist, a priest, a political player, and a guy who took his rage and turned it into some of the most powerful writing you'll ever read. So let's try to get a handle on the art of his anger.
Okay, just take a second to read that quote. That is a pretty brutal take on humanity, right? Well, what if I told you that line comes from a book that most of us remember as a kid's adventure story? Yep, that's from Gulliver's Travels. And that one sentence, it's like a key that unlocks the dark, beating heart of the whole book, and the man who wrote it.
So that begs the question, who was this guy who looks at his own species and thinks, yep, vermin? Was he just a straight-up hater of mankind, a total misanthrope? Or was there something else going on, something deeper, maybe even moral, behind all that rage? And this gets us right to the central puzzle of Jonathan Swift. Was he a misanthrope, someone who just genuinely hated people? Or was he a moralist, and a fierce one at that, using these shocking words to try and shake us all awake, to fix a world he saw as completely broken? I mean, look at this. It's the perfect split screen of his personality. On one side, you have his writing, which is just dripping with pure disgust for how people behave. But on the other side, this is the same guy who passionately fought for the oppressed in Ireland and went after hypocrisy like a heat-seeking missile. That tension, right there, is what made him who he was.
To really get what he was doing in his work, you first have to look at his life. And let me tell you, it was just one big bundle of contradictions. These conflicts, personal and political, they weren't just background noise, they were the very fuel for his satirical fire.
You can actually see the conflict just by looking at the map of his life. He's born in Dublin, Ireland, then he's off to England to try and make it big, but eventually he has to go back to Ireland, where he spends his last few decades. This constant back and forth between the center of empire and this oppressed colony is absolutely key to understanding him.
And this slide just lays out that core division perfectly. He was English by blood, by ambition. He was even related to the famous poet John Dryden. But his life, his day-to-day reality, was Irish. He was born there, he died there, and he became this incredible champion for the Irish people against English cruelty. Even while, privately, he wrote about how much he disliked them. That sense of not belonging anywhere, that alienation, fueled so much of his anger. Oh, and it did not stop there. He was an Anglican priest who was also a hardcore political operative, even switching parties when it suited him. His love life? Shrouded in mystery, with these two intense but very strange relationships. Add to that a lifelong disease that gave him vertigo and nausea, which, you can imagine, fed into this increasingly dark view of the world that, tragically, ended with him losing his mind.
So what do you do with all that anger and inner conflict? Well, if you're Jonathan Swift, you forge it into a weapon. And that weapon was satire. It was the absolute perfect tool for a guy who wanted to tear down the hypocrisy and sheer absurdity he saw all around him.
Let's take an early work, A Tale of a Tub. He tells this simple-sounding story about a father who leaves coats to his 3 sons. But of course, it's an allegory. The sons are the major branches of Christianity, and he uses the story to create this scathing, hilarious takedown of the entire history of the church, including his own. The guy was afraid of nothing.
But of all his satirical works, the most notorious has gotta be A Modest Proposal. The title, it sounds so polite, doesn't it? So reasonable. But what he's actually proposing is probably the single most shocking idea in all of English literature.
His technique here is just brilliant in its brutality. First, he lays out a real, horrifying problem, the crushing poverty in Ireland. Then, with the calm, cool logic of an economist, he proposes his modest solution, that the Irish should just sell their babies as food for the rich English landlords. The idea is monstrous, of course, and that's the whole point. He created a proposal so horrific, it was meant to show everyone that the real-world situation, the indifference, the cruelty, was already a monstrous horror.
And that brings us circling right back to his masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels. You see, it's not just one adventure. It's 4 separate journeys, and with each one, Swift pulls us deeper and deeper into his own despair about humanity. This book is the grand finale of a lifetime of anger. The first trip to Lilliput is the one everyone knows. By making the people 6 inches tall, Swift makes their politics look ridiculous. They're going to war over which end of an egg to crack. He's holding up a mirror to us, showing us how petty and absurd our own power struggles really are.
Then, in the second voyage, he flips it.
Now Gulliver's the tiny one, living among giants. And when he proudly tells the giant king all about Europe, our politics, our wars, our legal system, the king is just disgusted. And it's his reaction that gives us that quote from the beginning, calling us all odious vermin.
The third voyage takes aim at a new target, the philosophers and scientists of the Age of Reason. He shows us these so-called geniuses on a flying island, so lost in bizarre projects, like trying to get sunbeams out of cucumbers, that they are totally clueless about the real human suffering happening on the ground right below them.
But it's the last voyage that hits the hardest. This is where the story stops being funny and turns into a full-on scream of disgust. We arrive in a land that isn't ruled by people at all, but by intelligent, calm, perfectly rational horses.
And here it is, his final brutal verdict. In this land, the humans, called yahoos, are savage, greedy, filthy animals. They are the worst of the worst. And the horses, the huienums, are everything we're not, rational, virtuous, and calm. Gulliver lives with them, and by the end he is so disgusted by the yahoos that he can't even stand to look at another human being, including himself.
So, where does that leave us? What is the legacy of this brilliant, furious man? Well, it's messy. It's defined by this incredibly powerful and really uncomfortable disgust with the world.
I think this summary just nails it. Gulliver's Travels isn't just a critique of this or that. You could argue it's a fundamental rejection of, well, us, of humanity itself. It's a book that pulls absolutely no punches.
And yet, here we are, still reading him hundreds of years later. Why? Because underneath all that bleakness, the man was a genius. His writing is crystal clear. He found this perfect balance between wild fantasy and razor-sharp criticism. He basically took a vision of pure hatred for humanity and somehow turned it into timeless, world-class literature.
Which leaves us with one last thing to think about. You know, we live in an age that's full of outrage, especially online, but a lot of it feels kind of shallow, doesn't it? So here's the question. Is Jonathan Swift's kind of deep, savage, morally driven satire something we're lucky to have moved past? Or is it exactly the kind of cold, uncomfortable truth-telling that we desperately need right now?